Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for part 2 of our discussion from Deep Calls Unto Deep from chapter 3 and volume 2 of the Basic Elements of the Christian Life. Tony, in the last chapter, we talked about how this comes from Psalms 42, verse 7, and even how this point is related to our Christian life. But the book goes on to discuss 2 specific examples from the Bible. Can we begin today by discussing the first example from Isaiah with Hezekiah?
Hezekiah, being a negative example, points to his being superficial and hasty in taking care of his possessions before God. And we're not talking about physical possessions, we're talking about spiritual possessions. The contrasting example is with Paul, who was greatly used by the Lord, and all of us today are beneficiaries of his service. Something has endured through the ages because he was one who understood the principle of taking care of the hidden life.
Okay, so as you mentioned, there's these 2 examples. There's the example of Hezekiah, which is kind of a negative example and a warning for us. But then we also have the Apostle Paul as a positive example. What can you tell us more about Paul and his experience that is a positive example for us?
Well, Paul was one who had very deep experience of the Lord, and we know this particularly in chapter 12 of 2 Corinthians, where he shares with the believers in Corinth an experience that he had 14 years earlier. And it is believed that he never mentioned this before. And it was somewhat stunning to realize that Paul had kept within him such a transcendent experience of Christ, actually very deep, very spiritual, and you need to read those chapters. He never mentioned them for 14 years. And even when he did mention them, he mentioned them in a very, very brief way. This shows that he highly valued personal experiences with the Lord, and that he didn't just open them up and display them in a superficial way. Contrasting, Hezekiah had obtained much before God, much wealth, much possessions, but because he displayed them in an undiscerning way to the visitors from Babylon 100 years later, the kingdom was lost in a captivity. And so I think you can see there's a great contrast between 2 people of God and how they handled their possessions before God.
Yeah, the chapter really helps us to see that the Apostle Paul had this experience, but he didn't, kind of reveal it in a careless or a loose way. But he very much was before the Lord about, when to speak this experience and other experiences, and even how much of those experiences to speak. What we see from this is that it allowed him to have a hidden life with the Lord, which caused him to have deep roots in his Christian life. So for everyone who's viewing and who's listening today, how can we look at this positive example of the Apostle Paul, and how can we kind of apply it and experience it in our Christian life?
Well, simply, we need to realize that the Christian life is a hidden life, primarily. It is not necessarily an outward life of doing works. It's not a life of making displays to others, but it's a hidden life before God. The vast majority of our Christian experience is personal, it's hidden, and it establishes a deep root system that we derive from our whole Christian life. It sustains us, it meets our need, and at the same time, those who touch or are in contact with a person who is in the depths will realize that this person has something of life, something of Christ. And even though he may not say much, he may not talk much, yet there's something being ministered to others. And this is a strong warning to us that if we don't develop a hidden life, if we don't care for our spiritual relationship with God as treasures and as possessions to be guarded, then we may just be a superficial Christian, saying things, talking about experiences. All the while, we've lost our fellowship with the Lord. This is not the testimony of the Apostle Paul, and Watchman Nee's concern is that we would fall into this trap of a superficial Christian life.
It's been really good to see that in our Christian life, we need to have this hidden life with the Lord, and not expose all of our experiences with Him, and every every experience that we have of the Lord, but really, we have to be guarded in our experiences and allow the Lord to grow deep in us. And even to guard these experiences and not to just, talk about them at any time, in any place, but even to ask the Lord, Lord, what should I speak? How should I speak this? And things like this. So this is just a very good principle for us to learn for our Christian life so that we can be those who have a deep root system with the Lord. I think we both agree, for those who are watching, we'd really encourage you to order this book and especially read this chapter so that you can see this matter more clearly related to deep calls unto deep.